Liebe Gäste, ich wechsle gleich auf Englisch, weil der Talk heute Abend auch auf Englisch sein wird und unsere Gäste Englisch sprechen. Dear guests, thank you for coming to Kampnagel tonight and welcome to the opening keynotes of the Black Europe focus within the series Other Europe, Perspectives on Identity and Diversity. I'm very excited to introduce to you today our wonderful guests, Dr. Olivette Otele. She will be here with us via Zoom because the numbers in the UK are quite high still. And Olivette Otele is a professor of history of slavery and memory of enslavement at the University of Bristol. She is a fellow and a vice president of the Royal Historical Society and holds a PhD in history from the University in Paris, La Sorbonne. In her research, she explores colonial and post-colonial history and the histories of people of African descent. For example, in her book, African-Europeans, An Untold History, Olivette Otele offers a new history that celebrates the lives of African-Europeans through tracing a long African-European heritage, drawing connections across time and space. And for Black European consciousness and the remembrance and reappearance of our Black European history and ancestors, this is such crucial and valuable work. Tonight she will talk about disposable Black bodies, ontological insecurity, metaphorical literal homelessness, and the means to fight racial and social inequality. I'm very much looking forward to hearing this and welcome you to Kampnagel tonight, Olivette. Olivette Otele will be here via Zoom, like I said, yeah, a warm welcome. Thank you for making the time. And I will introduce all the other speakers so you don't have to see my face again on the stage. Our second speaker will be Dr. SA Smythe. Dr. SA Smythe is a poet, translator, and assistant professor of Black European Cultural Studies, Contemporary Mediterranean Studies, and Black Trans Poetics at the University of California, Los Angeles, the UCLA, where they research relational aspects of Black belonging beyond borders. They are the editor of Troubling the Grounds, Global Configurations of Blackness, Nativism, and Indigeneity. This is such a hard word for Germans. A special issue for postmodern culture. They're also working on the forthcoming book, Where Blackness Meets the Sea, on crisis culture and the Black Mediterranean. Also forthcoming is a full volume of poetry titled Proclivity, which takes up a familiar history of Black migration, trans embodiment, and Black liberation. SA is winner of the 2022 Rome Prize and is currently based between Rome and Los Angeles. Tonight, I'm not done. Tonight, SA will hold a keynote titled Black Possibility Across the Mediterranean, which I'm very much looking forward hearing. SA, I wished I had known your work when I was still in academia, but I am the more pleased to have you here today. Thank you for coming and welcome to Kampnagel. And the joint discussion at the end of both keynotes will be moderated by Magnus Elias Rosengarten. Magnus is a writer, artist, and currently co-curator of AMA, 4 days on caring, repairing, and healing at Gropiusbau, which will open in November. He has written for Contemporary and End Magazine, Art Forum, and Berlin Biennale, as well as presenting work at the Crane Theater in New York and the California African American Museum in Los Angeles. Magnus studied at Humboldt University Berlin and completed a graduate degree in performance studies at the NYU in New York. Magnus, thank you for agreeing to moderate this evening today on such short notice, and a very warm welcome to Kampnagel. I heard it's the first time you're here, but for sure not the last. Welcome. And Now, and then I'm done, some organizational notes. We will have Olivette Otele via Zoom now, followed by essay, and then we will have a moderated discussion around half an hour, and in the end you will also have the chance to ask questions if you dare to come down here and speak into this microphone. And for the public online, you can ask questions via text to the number that should be on the screen right now, and you can also find it below the video, and we will blend it in later as well. So yes, Olivette, essay, and Magnus, again, warm welcome, and dear guests, please enjoy the evening.
Thank you very much for having me here tonight. I'm absolutely delighted to be here, well, virtually. I was hoping I would be able to be with you, but circumstances didn't make it possible. However, I'm very excited to be in conversation with SA. I truly believe that she's one of the brightest, one of the most superb, younger superb minds of our generation, really, of her generation. And her work is absolutely groundbreaking. So I'm excited about, having a second conversation with her tonight. Okay, so my talk, the idea behind the talk that I was about to give tonight was to give a good overview of African European lives and experiences as I have presented them in my book. I have, however, decided to share with you more about lived experiences by using the lens of ego history or ego-histoire and insecurity. Ego-histoire is a branch of history that is based on one's journey. It means that my lived experience as a Black woman will be part of the narrative. Why that? Because our experiences as people of African descent and lives are not to be left in books, only for people to ponder, but our journeys are living memories, ever-changing, dynamic, with urgent issues that need to be addressed. This talk is about the last part of my book, African European Experiences in the 21st Century. Okay, so I want to talk about, indeed, disposable Black bodies. I want to talk about the legacies of the past, ontological insecurity, and literal and metaphorical homelessness. I know that's a lot in just 30 minutes, but please bear with me. So disposable Black bodies are those captured, kept alongside African coasts in forts, then shipped across the oceans. They are bodies that stayed, famished, in dislocated family units that had neither unity nor family warmth after the capture of siblings, mothers, fathers, daughters, sons. I want to talk about those who were left on the continent, stayed, afraid, unprotected, at the mercy of slave catchers, merchant, powerful African monarchs, unable to thrive. I'm constantly shifting back and forth, unable to focus, but still feeling the pain of those displaced from their homes. The 9 to 12 million people trafficked across the Atlantic over 3 centuries. The 9 million plus humans taken across the Sahara Desert over an even longer period of time. And a known number of children, women, and men forced south of the continent and towards the Indian Ocean. The experiences of each trajectory different. The stories of Indian Ocean slavery and Atlantic slavery bear similarities and yet differs in so many other ways. I want to talk about human beings, not seen as such, yet used as currency, commodities, reproductive tools, forcibly taken to the Caribbean, to the Americas, used as labor to enrich the plantocracy, a system that listed them, gave and logged them on a book with new names, keeping the details of lives turned into transactional deeds. I want to talk about Black bodies, worked to the bone, worked to extinction, replaced by new ones, shiny new ones, young new ones, painfully fit new ones for the new harvests. I want to talk about children, women, and men, used in their souls and bodies, assaulted spirits who nonetheless grinded their teeth, continued to toil, but also to plot, skillfully, subtly, and unsubtly, resisting subjugation, compromising to survive, engaging in submissive resilience dance. I want to talk about female bodies as a locus for trauma, despair, but also hope, renewed energy, and utter rage. I'm angry and tired, angry at the laziness of hope without action, tired of words without deeds. I'm usually an optimist, and I see hopelessness as a trope we cannot afford to dwell on for too long if we are, as people of African descent, in the global north, if we are to survive systemic violence. Don't get me wrong, hopelessness as a feeling is perfectly understandable. After all, we too are humans, even though they try to pretend otherwise, even though they buried their conscience, changed their ethics, muted their doubts, legalized the traffic so that they could build their capitalist kingdoms, fortresses, nations, states, identities. We too are allowed to feel the brunt of despair. But what I'm saying is that even our hopelessness had served their purpose. After all, isn't what the whole project was about? Remember, you cannot keep people under the yoke of slavery without psychologically breaking them, turning them into hopeless beings. The whole system was designed to show them that they had no way to run or hide, that they had no future outside the bonds of plantation economy, and that the almighty Christian God would reward and protect them in heaven, and that, thank Jesus, they'll be free at last. So hopelessness as a permanent state, as a mindset that suppresses action, is dangerous for us. Now, one can feel totally hopeless and yet be prompted to act. In other words, one does not have to be a massive optimist to do what needs to be done for social, gender, racial justice. I just want people to understand that one of the legacies of the past is those unseen inhibitors that suppress our ability to envisage a positive future in which we are not present. Yes, there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma. In other words, what we are doing here now in terms of fighting inequalities might not succeed in our lifetime, but we still need to do it because our ancestors fought for us to exist literally in these spaces. Now, I want to talk about mental slavery and the bonds that keep us from breaking the vicious circle of discrimination. We've come a long way in our fight for equity. The slave rebellions, the 19th century colonial wars against the oppressors, the anti-colonial movement between the world wars, the post-Second World War, war of decolonization, the decolonization movement as a whole across the continent, while the African continent and elsewhere. And we now know that these, decolonization wars were not at all peaceful as we've been taught, or some of us have been taught. The 1960s, the 1970s, the civil rights movement, the race riots in the US, Britain, France, the 1980s Brixton, Toxteth, Bristol riots, and the police chase and the accidental electrocution of young Zayed Benna, of Bouna Traoré, that led to the French riots, or émeutes de banlieue, in 2005. The pre and post-George Floyd executions of Black bodies, the subsequent demonstration and so on, have shown us that we make some progress, we have made some progress with laws in place. However, something is profoundly rotten in the kingdom of racial equity. Those laws continue to fail minority groups because we are still going around the same mountain of racism over and over again. There is no significant culture shift, and this point is important, culture shift that allows racist mentality to die out. Racism adapts, racism finds new, polite forms that allows it to define equality measures. In other words, what is called the post-Obama or post-George Floyd backlash is essentially proof that the power to make significant changes is in the hand of a greater number, but the power to actually influence change is still in the hand of a few. The backlashes, we are told, is from a small number of far-right people, right-wing people, but the very fact that those groups have such a big reach also tells me that the masses, the majority group, is still ready to listen to them. In other words, the cultural social shifts that is needed to change perceptions at a deeper level hasn't happened yet. Sure, more people accept and tolerate Black people around them, or even accept that they can be in positions of power, but have more than one Black person in that position of power, and you'll see different reactions. You'll see people shifting on their seats and comfortable. Some will even talk about the theory of the Great Replacement. I guess what I'm saying is that the slave mentality doesn't apply only to Black people. It is also the belief that one is superior at so many levels to others. It might not be conscious. In fact, some of you might even think you are open-minded. After all, you are listening to this talk, but how many would actually leave and a protected, privileged space to a person of minority group, ethnic group to occupy? This is not really a question I'm asking you at individual level. Systemic racism means a whole system is oppressive and has put safeguarding measures to protect its own privileges. The job landscape, for example, is quite revealing. There are only 2 Black women history professors in the UK in 2021 now. I was the first one. African Europeans are still, for the vast majority, at the bottom of the social ladder in the global north. What are you personally, institutionally doing to change that? Inviting some of us to talk is a great step forward, but as a very tired Black woman who has been fighting on these intellectual streets and public platforms for decades, I'm tired of words without deeds. Words can prompt people into action though, I know that, and that is the reason why I'm still also here talking to you. My questions to you is or are you doing enough to get that culture shift? Are we engaging productively with the silent majority that is still ambivalent and listening to the enraged minority of far right? Word of advice though, or rather a caution. As a Black person, as a woman, I've stopped trying to engage with racists outside classrooms and platforms a long time ago. They seek me out, they write to me, they try and get a reaction, they insult me, they threaten me. I generally don't respond. I involve the police when necessary, because I'm not paid to make them feel or be less stupid. Free labor is already expected from academics. Women are already putting in the work of emotional labor in our higher education institutions without me having to do that with random folks. And more importantly, it is harmful for me and to me to have to explain and justify my very existence on this earth. But this is where allyship comes into place, where you come into place. You from the global majority, in Europe that is. What are you doing to ignite profound changes? What is your radical stance on racial equality? What is your contribution to creating a home for all of us as human beings? The concept of home is a very important one. I want to dwell a bit on that because it is also linked to ontological insecurity. Anthony Giddens explored the idea of ontological security. Jennifer Mitson worked on the role of the state that can put our physical security at risk in the name of providing an overall security umbrella. In other words, what she's saying is that the state can put our own physical security at risk because they will justify by saying that they are providing an umbrella security that protects many. But actually, that umbrella serves as a marker of identity. In other words, Black bodies in Spain, for example, pointed out as dangerous figures by the state through systematic racial profiling is a process that works. Let me explain. Overuse of racial profiling tells people that there is a danger. Why Black people are stopped so many times, there is probably a danger. And the state is telling them that that danger has been identified. That danger has got a black and brown face. It's being taken care of. People seeing those profiling in turn interpret them as necessary to protect them. If the state is doing that, it means we are safe. Keep doing that, safe. Police, keep profiling. So the profiling serves as a tool, an efficient one, I might add, to cement racial identities. It's them versus us. Us from European descent, them, well, from whatever. I'm a migrant. I'm an immigrant, despite European passport, wherever I go. Home is a fleeting concept and a painful reality that was shaped by my family history and its interaction with colonial powers. Like many African-born, I didn't know the continent, or I don't know the continent as much as people think. In fact, I spent more time in Europe than in Cameroon. Yet I'm not allowed to claim these lands, France, Britain, Wales, as mine because of the color of my skin. A Polish person, for example, who has a similar trajectory, born in Poland, grew up in Paris or in Britain, will be seen after a while as Welsh, as British, as French, because they are not visibly different from white Britons or white French. But much more than that, the racial difference is cemented in otherness. That is the reason why so many have a hard time accepting that one can be of African descent and yet European. At a basic level, one can accept that you can have people of African descent or Black people who are German, but at an intergenerational level, at a deeper level, sometimes subtle level, that knowledge is mingled with the idea of migrated bodies and otherness. In other words, as long as you still look like a person of African descent, you are at some level never fully European. Now, does it really matter? Ultimately, isn't all this about just treating people in a decent way, no matter what their background? Well, I wish things were this clear-cut. When decency is based on a feeling, it also legitimizes indecency. In other words, those who are not feeling like being nice and are not feeling, as prompt as to do the right thing can just be nasty, and it's just as legitimate as those who are decent. In other words, why rely on decency? That's why if a deep cultural shift leads to mentality change and then to changes in law, we cannot afford to wait for people to have enough decent feelings to fight discrimination. There is a catch, isn't there? On the one hand, I'm telling you that a small number of people are influencing the debate and the laws are too timid, and we need a broader cultural change led by the majority of people. And on the other hand, I'm telling you that the majority of people are way too slow and horribly easy to sway and influence, and they have been listening to the racist voice. That is why we don't see radical changes in favor of racial justice. What is the solution then? Well, I don't have most answers. What I do say, though, is that historically, long-lasting changes were those that were made and supported by the majority of people. So our role really is to continue to engage with people, as painful as it is. The journey towards ontological insecurity is explored in the edited volume I co-edited with Dr. Luisa Gandolfo and Yoav Gallet, and it is entitled Post-Conflict Memorialization, Missing Memorials, Absent Bodies. So in the epilogue, we look at and we add another element to this idea of insecurity. And it is about how COVID-19 has cemented identities. For example, at the beginning in Britain, the Thursday, people would come outside and clap to support the National Health Service. The simple act became a nationalist stick to police citizens, a marker of identity and difference that the state linked with the Second World War stories of resilience. Let me explain. So for people clapping, it became oh, this is how we remember. We used to do that. We used to engage as a society during the Second World War. And those stories, of course, of Second World War have historically excluded people of African descent, as if empire subjects didn't fight alongside white British during the wars. Ontological insecurity yet again serves the state. As far as the concept of home is concerned, it needs to be addressed. It is also linked to the notion of security, safety, and feeling protected. People would do anything to protect their homes. And in Britain, years of austerity measures under the leadership of the Conservative governments have led many from all backgrounds already on the brink of poverty to plunge into the abyss of dire poverty. And yet, the Brexit debate rallied some spirits. We have a divided country on the one hand, and the idea of insecurity, though, a threat to whom, was used to win votes for Brexit. Eventually, we're all losing. In the midst of all that, minority ethnic groups, Black people, were also used as tools. The closeness to the Commonwealth would dangle before people's eyes to get them to support Brexit. They would tell them that, in the alleged good old days of the Commonwealth, well, people were better off. Minority people might have been better off because what happened is the UK joined the single market in the European Union, and the Commonwealth was crushed and the ties with the Commonwealth were crushed. Historically, it's not true, of course. But interestingly enough, Black, Asian, and minority groups are not, according to statistics, those who voted for Brexit in the end. Yet the idea of insecurity prevailed. And ironically enough, 6 years after the campaign, the Brexit campaign, fuel shortages, food disruption, post-Brexit are again threatening that semblance of unity amongst Brexiteers. In that context, home for people like me is an even more fluid concept that is also shaped by state failures and by a context marred by literal homelessness. What do I mean by this? It means that my understanding of home is influenced by what I see around me, by dire poverty. More and more young people in families on the streets, rough sleepers, EU rough sleepers deported, and a hierarchy of pain in Britain 2021. It has become more about a narrative that says, let's protect ourselves against the European invaders. Let's protect ourselves against minority ethnic invaders, and more specifically against Black bodies. Let's profile them more, police their every movement more, contain them in mental institutions and in prisons. I'm referring here to what is known as the Lamy Report and the disproportionate number of young Black men in the criminal justice system in the UK. The discrepancy in sentencing them to prison for crimes that do not warrant imprisonment, etc. What I mean by hierarchy of pain is that unstable social situation has created anxiety for all, and yet that anxiety was not and is not used as a field for cross-community solidarity. Pain does not unite communities right now. We saw the toppling of Colston statue and how young people from all backgrounds, and in fact, mostly those racialized as white and dual heritage, were at the forefront and toppled the statue. Yet you have older generations that are closing ranks. What we see is a lack of challenge of certain structures and institutions. The police is one of them. I want to reflect briefly on the idea of insecurity and link it to current affairs, and in particular, to what is happening right now in the UK regarding the killing of Sarah Everard, Sabina Nessa, and others. I want to link this to the lack of debate about intersectional insecurity when it comes to police brutality and how the current state of affairs challenges the contours of the Me Too movement. I won't be too long about this. Sarah Everard was a white woman who was assaulted and killed by a police officer. A rarity, the story provoked such an outrage that we saw several demonstrations across the country about gender-based violence and police brutality. The UK government responded by trying to pass a bill that gave more power to the police, and we saw more demonstrations. Yesterday, the police officer, who was nicknamed by his colleagues the rapist because of previous incidents, received a prison life sentence. Prior to the sentence, woman Sabina Nessa of Albanian origin was killed by a man. That too ignited outrage. A short show of revulsion or outrage did appear last year when we all learned that two young Black women, Nicole Smallman and Biba Henry, were stabbed by an unknown assailant in June 2020. And the police officers in charge took selfies of the dead bodies and shared them, for fun apparently, on WhatsApp with colleagues. The officers were temporarily suspended pending inquiry, but no strong message was given with regards to the power of the Metropolitan Police. What really puzzles me, no, what really enrages me is the fact that outrage against the police happened after the killings of white women, while disappearances, instances of police violence beside racial profiling against Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people hadn't shaken the British police, the British public enough for them to truly question the ways in which the Metropolitan Police operated. So far, it seems that Black lives were still seen as disposable enough, and that neglect and state of affairs has led people to ignore intrinsic violence of the Metropolitan Police as an institution. Okay, just like the Me Too movement became in France a white women movement that tended to exclude Black and Muslim female voices, just like some part of the Me Too UK advocates excluded trans women voices, police violence in the UK only came to the forefront for the majority of people when the attacks were directed at white women. What should be done now? Well, I'm really hoping to see a deeper understanding of how state violence works. Contrary to what many say, violence is not the work of just a few bad apples. It is about an institution that was allowed to inflict violence to its citizens, mostly Black and minority ethnic people, without being challenged for such a long time that that institution felt so secure and secure enough to spread that violence to white women. It is about a system that protects those so-called bad apples, because that is a racist and sexist institution at its core. The problem is that it has also become, to some extent, a criminal organization with literally instances where some police officers are committing crimes. I can give you several examples, caught on camera and so on. What I'm working on is on the idea of unifying the diverse voices of resistance against violence. I want to end on a positive note of hope, because this is exactly what unifying voices look like. I want to share this because although I'm still tired, although I'm still very angry, actions when it comes to fighting racism are needed. We have so much work to do, and I can't dwell for too long on hopelessness. A few months ago, I was approached by a group of white Welsh women to deliver a speech about the statue of a formidable woman I knew and who passed away in 2017. She was called Betty Campbell. She was born in 1934 in Cardiff, Wales, in a multicultural community known as Bute Town. She became the first Black woman head teacher in Wales. She was instrumental in having Black history considered in the curriculum, way before our time. A few months back, these Welsh women launched, they launched a national survey and vote about which statue of people of Wales would like to see erected, while Betty Campbell's name came on top of the vote. These white women found sponsors, pestered the city, mobilized forces, and made it happen. Because what they see as the victory of one woman, even a Black woman, is a victory for all women. These are the kind of initiatives I want to see. These are the kind of solidarity and work I want to get involved in. I'm inviting you to Google Betty Campbell's statue. You'll see what I mean. It's an amazing story. It's the amazing trajectory of an African European woman. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, Olivette. Well, I'll thank you in the talk. Thank you so much to Corina, to Eva, Magnus, and all others working to produce this phenomenal series of events here at Camp Nagel. I'm honored to be here in Hamburg and to be able to share the stage, so to speak, with Professor Otele, who, just as an aside note, she's already mentioned it, but being the first Black woman professor of history is groundbreaking in its own right, as well as her research and the work that she's doing in her presence and in her scholarship for Black British scholars, Black scholars in Britain. We can't praise it enough. Thank you, all of you here today who are here to fellowship in realizing the generations-long struggle for Black freedoms across Europe and to share in the knowledge of the difficulties and barriers from transnational and post-colonial European contexts, as well as of the unfolding lessons learned from across the Atlantic, the Caribbean, Asia, elsewhere. Attention is a gift. And in this wearisome, ongoing, hyper-digital era of competing catastrophes, proliferating pandemics, it's a precious commodity. So I'm grateful for all of you for sharing the resource of your time with me. Allow me to begin with a land acknowledgement, precisely because we are forged by different lands, different points of departure from which we might enter into a conversation on belonging. I currently live in Rome, as Corina mentioned, but I'm employed on the homelands of the Ahochimin and Tongva peoples, who, in the face of ongoing settler colonialism, continue to claim their place and act as stewards of their ancestral lands. Here, broadly, in Germany, there are an estimated 170,000 to 300,000 Roma and Sinti people, the majority of whom experience generations of contested citizenship and non-belonging. This same place, which we refer to as Deutschland, was also forged in colonial conquest throughout the African, Arab, and Asian world. So no matter the spaces our bodies or memories occupy across space-time as we fellowship in this one, the intellectual and affective project of attending to Black life and possibility requires us to bring our creative attention to the sustained and improvisational modes of liberation, of freedom dreaming, of sovereignty and solidarity practiced in concert across various regions of the globe in ways past, present, emerging, and always deeply interrelated. So this is also what we acknowledge when we acknowledge the land. As a Black trans feminist and post-colonial subject myself, it's always important for me to foreground the Black, Indigenous, and ancestral queer community I hold as we amplify cosmologies of return and liberation. We, and I do hope to clarify that pronoun, we must collectively make sure that we never take our presences at this time with these technologies of belonging and relation for granted. Otherwise, none of us is or will ever be truly free. Effectively, that's the talk. But this, like everything else I do, is rooted in the relationship between Blackness and belonging. More specifically, I'm interested in a host of Black methods organized around a set of questions. What do we owe to each other, and to whom do we belong? Where do we begin? How do Black imaginative and literary practices move us to realize collective liberation? Today we'll talk a bit about Black people, trans people, queer people, and migrants from Africa and its diasporas, how they configure identity and well-making by collectively enacting practices of what I'll call, riffing off of Edward Said, contrapuntal belonging, a kind of reorganizing practice and analytic that ruptures the current oppressive world order and state recognition. As a side note, grief similarly does this reorganizing work, and so I do want to honor those we have lost, and those I've particularly lost, most recently my grandfather, without whom I would not be here before you today. Joy as well, the willful breathing into the pleasure of otherwise possibility, can do that reorganizing work too. At a time when the global experiences and studies of those people collectively facing ethno-nationalist antagonism, erasure, and other modes of violence, we must turn to those theories of possibility, and I turn to the literary imagination in the genealogy of those like Toni Morrison, Audre Lorde, and Mai Aim. We must continue to look into something beyond patriarchal and white supremacist cultural production and ideologies to resist the framework of normativity. Now I'm going to read from the opening chapter of my book. I'll keep saying my book until it exists. That's sort of a manifestation. First, let us set the scene with the sea. Almost 5 years ago, on 26 January 2017, footage surfaced of the 22-year-old Gambian national Patès Sabali thrashing forcefully in the middle of the renowned Grand Canal in the serene city of Venice. Hundreds of onlookers were caught on film, jeering, gawking, waiting on the scene's denouement. Some of them laughed. At least one shouted, "Africa, Africa, oh!" as Sabali's torso slowly disappeared under the wet, the water up to his neck and his arms shooting straight up, nothing visible below the elbows. "Butal salvagente," demanded another, as a boat full of people, tourists, bobbed gently, almost purposefully by, mere meters from Sabali's body, which dipped and resurfaced with increased frequency. The onlookers looked on. "Butal salvagente, butal salvagente," the cameraman's disembodied voice demanded again with more urgency. The people on the boat remained still for a few moments more. Eventually, a few stirred and threw 2 or 3 of the lifebuoys overboard. Sabali did not grasp them, did not appear to fully lunge forward over the echo of more laughter and gasps from the crowd. One particularly flustered and indifferent spectator scoffed that Sabali just wanted to die. "Just let him die then," said another. In the very asymmetrical reporting on Sabali's drowning, a few headlines reported on the shocking complicity of the tourists and the lack of so-called heroism amidst the crowd. But the media also picked up the narrative that Sabali wanted to die without any confirmation, with reports like, "African refugee Patès Sabali drowned self in Venice as tourists look on," and "Venice to pay for funeral of migrant whose suicide was filmed by tourists." The latter article has several quotes from the mayor of Venice, former mayor Luigi Brugnaro, attesting to the benevolence and goodwill of the city. The money for his funeral will come from Venice Mayor Luigi Brugnaro's personal cost of living allowance in a gesture of respect from Venice towards Patès Sabali and his shattered dreams, he said, adding that the death of this young man has saddened all of us, and we feel pity towards those who, faced with the adversities of life, no longer find the strength to react to desperation. We can't possibly continue to nurture hopes of half the world coming to Italy. Everyone needs to realize it is impossible for our country to continue managing a large-scale phenomenon in the way it has done so far. Of course, there is so much bound up in this politician's expressions of unaccountable pity, metastasizing Sabali's story, which again has been largely unconfirmed in his cause of death or hypothetical motivations, and rendering him a metaphor for all migrants, refugees, and asylum seekers in Italy. The resignifications of his final actions and inactions were an ultimate violence to someone whose death was rendered a spectacle, his final gasp for breath a repository of negative affect and dehumanizing racial hatred. The ripples of warning emanated from his lifeless body. "Abandon hope, all ye who enter here or wash upon the shore." Reports also came in soon after, identifying Sabali as the drowned figure, saying that he had initially obtained the permesso di soggiorno, the temporary residency papers for Italy, on humanitarian grounds, having sailed from Africa, probably making the trek from his native the Gambia on the west coast to a port in Libya, before setting sail across the Mediterranean and arriving in Italy 2 years prior, where his claims for asylum were ultimately rejected. We find a similar narrative for 31-year-old Musie, an Eritrean asylum seeker who lived in Italy for almost 2 years, who hanged himself on Via Aldini near Milan Central Station. Even though he had no discernible connection to the organization, most of the scant news reportings noted that he took his life mere steps from the Arca Foundation, one of Italy's humanitarian nonprofits dedicated to welcoming refugees. Of course, the Germans know all about this. In doing so, they fail to highlight how his death marked the spite of constant and increasingly aggressive raids and identity checks for racialized people in the area. Some of those raids were unauthorized harassment from Italian soldiers at the station who got into verbal altercations with presumed migrants that occasionally turned physical, even as no arrests were made or reports filed by the soldiers or police who were witnesses and perpetrators. The last such bout, reported by migrant and non-migrant witnesses alike, was on April 21st of that year. Italian police conducted at least 2 identity control operations between April 25th, ironically the anniversary of Italy's 1945 Liberation Day, marking the end of the fascist regime and the end of Italy's Nazi occupation, and May 2nd. Lucia hanged himself on the 7th of May. Back in Venice, cries of "Scemo, vai via" spat from the crowd. Sabali's hands remained up in the air, perfectly vertical. Each time he bobbed, his body went lower. Soon, only the crown of his head shows, along with his fingertips. And then nothing. The rings of water that arrived when the lifebuoys made contact with the water and pushed it into outward puddles also reverberated into nothing. Soon the sea was still again. The viral video abruptly ends. Pates Sabali arrived by sea, and like so many others, he also departed that way. Narratives of the arrival of Black people across the globe so often appear to be bound to and by the water as we keep returning and being returned to it. Blackness and the fear of Blackness seem to be below the surface of everything, everywhere, and everywhen. The figure of the Black person, also known as the Black body or the Black life, and I would love in the Q&A to gloss the differences between the two and what they do to living Black people, haunts the world. For us, the water haunts back. When Black Canadian Trinidadian poet Dion Brand tells us that water is another country, there's so much power, trauma, and also possibility there, even when there is no there. Even as that which is liquid at times appears ubiquitous and mute, and the voice of our oppressors is the only one left to reverberate. The ubiquity of water is what ties us, binds us in time and spirit to the ontological depths of Black presence, and has been thought in historical and material relation to such bodies of water as the Caribbean Sea in Brathwaite, Glissant, and Thompson, to the Atlantic Ocean with Gilroy, McKittrick, Nassie Brown, Morgan, many others, and increasingly to the Mediterranean Sea, from Giuliani, Metsadra, Abulafia, etc. The histories are also bounded and dynamic, and the call for our liberation from that space is more than just a call to perform the constitutive outside. For what even is history to those drowning or hanging from the periphery of its margins or at the center of its spectacles? Another scene from the sea. In October 2014, the then allegedly centrist Italian government terminated the program known as Operazione Mare Nostrum, OMN. The name was itself an imperial callback to the Roman name for the Mediterranean Sea. The Latin term Mare Nostrum, our sea, has experienced several revivals. During the height of Italian nationalism during Risorgimento, it was a rallying cry used by poets and political agitators who saw Italy as a successor to the Roman Empire and wished to expand during the partition of Africa. It was revived again, of course, during fascism, spread throughout fascist propaganda, again for the sake of aggressive territorial expansion and so-called reclamation, it wasn't their land, of former lands. North and East Africa became known then as the fourth shore of Italy. This is the genealogy under which OMN's national security system, under the guise of international rescue operation, was authorized by Italy. It was since defunded when it appeared that the nation had to spend most of the money towards its own maintenance costs. OMN was a naval and air-based Coast Guard operation of sorts, charged with arresting traffickers and rescuing tens of thousands of migrants from shipwrecks and other maritime tragedy. It was established on the 18th of October in 2013 by the Italian government, a respective 10 and 2 days after the October 3 shipwreck, with over 360 confirmed deaths, 155 survivors, and the 11 October shipwreck, where there were 35 confirmed dead. Since then, of course, thousands have died crossing from the northern coast of Africa to Europe, specifically to Italy, via the Mediterranean, leading it to be referred to by many as the deadliest sea and deadliest migrant crossing in the world. I do want to highlight the farce of the recurrent practice of enumeration, of counting things in this way, counting people as things without actually being accountable to them, that seems to conform to the logics of accumulation that structure racial capitalism, in which the quantified abstraction of Black and/or migrant deaths by organizations such as the Internal Organization for Migration or various social and mass media reveals the calculated value of Black life through the state's own language of deficit, of dearth, and of debt. Again, I want us to hold the difference between Black bodies, Black people, and Black lives, and to think what statistics do to the Black living. More concretely, let us consider where we really account for the loss of Patek Sabali, of Musie, of Emmanuel Kirinamdi, and the dozens of others who were murdered or, quote, allowed to die by the necropolitical machinations and callous, dehumanizing statecraft once the Black and/or migrant subject reaches European soil. In my focus on Italy, I don't intend to let other European nation states off the hook. Catch me for a drink, we can talk about Britain, yeah? And we can hopefully speak more about Germany in the Q&A. This is something in which all of Europe is complicit in, all of it, be it for their withdrawal of funding, their past colonial exploitation and gross historical underdevelopment, current militaristic and neoliberal practices throughout the continent of Africa, which have exacerbated migration across the increasingly treacherous route. It is in the persistent absenting, unthinking, and simultaneously rendering extraneous of Black people in daily European life. In the current patrols that are being overseen by Frontex, the border agency for the European Union, a term that must be placed in inverted commas, in quotes, because it has willfully turned a blind eye and not see the thousands of requests for aid that is directly told state agencies like Italy's Coast Guard, that it would not respond immediately to distress calls as it pulled its patrol area further north towards Europe and away from known sites of frequent shipwrecks, contracting its borders where we are concerned. The Palestinian poet and visionary Mahmoud Darwish told us that the Mediterranean Sea does not end at the land's edge. And the Black Mediterranean that I want to discuss is a site and epistemology, a theory or means of knowing that fully acknowledges that reality. The heart of the matter is that the Black radical tradition and Black imaginative practices show us the way to use the broken pieces and fragments of our past, our misremembered histories, misspoken narratives, to make new things and make ourselves anew. That is what the work of Black Italian women that I write about and collaborate with, like Carla Maccoggi, Oisa Queensday, Ijaba Shego, Cristina Alifara, others, teach us, in part via meditations on citizenship, representation, and belonging. Now, when I talk about citizenship, I do want to acknowledge the productive tension between the project of affirmation towards belonging and the need for scrutiny, allowing a deeper understanding of the stakes held in desires and demands for citizenship itself, as well as the context in which those are reproduced. In the last few years, there's been a concerted parallel effort to push for an update in Italian legislation on immigration. There are activist chants of L'Italia sono anch'io, I am also Italy, or t-shirts that say made in Italy, or 18 jus soli, 18 jus soli, which is also paradigmatic of the state's inability to fully subjugate other elements in its regulation of national identity, despite the remnants of fascist and colonial policies. While this movement is sort of a boon for many immigrants, many Black people, Black Italian citizen subjects in Italy, offering more rights to systematically marginalized individuals, particularly children who are politically more palatable for a national Italian public and would benefit most directly, these new policies bring forth new questions and in some cases exacerbate old ones. The continued deferral of this conversation is also a testament to the lack of emergency, a miscalculation of what is the true crisis in the eyes of the state. For those listening in from the US, it's quite similar to the political brinksmanship or one-upsmanship regarding undocumented individuals or DACA recipients, dreamers. And so we can also think about those parallels. The proposed new law would lower the age at which people born in Italy to non-Italian parents could apply for citizenship from 18 years to between 10 and 12. Only children who've spent the last 5 years in Italian schools would be eligible. But it's not so clear, for example, how the new law and the new criteria might be uniformly applied. How could one measure the level of an immigrant's cultural integration? What, as one of the measures, is an Italian value, and who gets to decide what that is? How does an apparently inclusive policy, this codification of Italian citizenship, facilitate the continued dispossession and displacement of those who remain outside of a citizenship framework, and thus the project known as Europe writ large? And lastly, how does that mask the overtly universalist colonial framework through which rights are even bestowed based on cultural, political, and racial attachments? What if citizenship is the violence? As we routinely mark the anniversaries of migrant suicides, Black people fall into police, like George Floyd, as Professor Otele mentioned, fall into police violence and other vigilante justice, the termination of Coast Guard operations like Operazione Mare Nostrum and some of the most major shipwrecks off the coast of Italy in recent years, how do we account for the fact that the people drowned and almost always drowning in the Mediterranean will not soon have access to the modest improvements to Italian citizenship if they ever come to pass? To not reinscribe ourselves into a compendium of loss, perhaps, I argue, another orientation is required. One that does not look to state recognition, but considers an otherwise, a new coalitional practice that can be thought via the Mediterranean shores, rather than the national borders and valuation of human life from both within and without. I'm skipping ahead of myself. There's so many notes to myself, just like yelling at the state, and it's not helpful, so forgive me as I scroll through my own notes. So I posit the Black Mediterranean as one possible configuration already being mobilized within and beyond the geopolitical space of the Mediterranean itself. It's a concept I first read described by Alessandro Di Maio, who argues that, quote, the term focuses on the proximity that exists and has always existed between Italy and Africa, separated but also united by the Mediterranean and documented in legends, myths, histories, even in culinary traditions, in visual arts and religion. Also, in my view, the term and its attendant regionalism allows for a cultural syncretism, intimacy, and expansiveness beyond Italy, which is a nation state, and Africa, which is a continent. So I do want to sort of push and expand the asymmetry in that initial framing. So my engagement with the Black Mediterranean does not entirely follow that trajectory of Di Maio and her reading of Paul Gilroy's The Black Atlantic. I'm tracing the term back to the Black radical tradition via Cedric Robinson's Black Marxism, in which he continued the early legacy of diaspora studies and developed a conception of the Black Mediterranean as a precondition to the Black Atlantic and the making of Europe itself. For Gilroy, it was bound to the Middle Passage and pervasive genocidal politics therein. But rather than just a metaphor or a fixed geography, the Mediterranean, and we see in stories like Pateh Sabali's and Musia's that it's a site of Black knowledge production, resistance, death-making, yes, but also joy. And it doesn't just stop at the sea. This tension that I'm describing is something that Gloria Anzaldúa has talked about as a sustained contradiction, a space for fraught creativity and tension that leads to new consciousness. Black lesbian feminist, who I mentioned earlier, Audre Lorde, has told us that poetry is not a luxury, but a way that we give name to the nameless. So of course, we can extend this to other forms of cultural production, photography, dance, song, activism, social justice movements, etc., as we trend toward our collective liberation. The configuration of what I name Black transpoesis helps me to think about an expansion of the artistic and thus political capacity for naming and articulating Blackness outside of binary norms. A few more minutes. Poesis refers to the philosophy of creation and formation of figurative horizons. Etymologically, poesis is derived from the Greek word poesis, which means to make or to create. As such, it's the process of creativity and production itself, which canonical Western philosophy refers to as the activity in which someone brings something into being that has yet to exist prior to its creation. So really what I've been narrating throughout this talk is coming to terms with Black subjectivity as poesis itself. This is to identify Black subjectivity as the capacity for invention of one's own paradigms for existence, one's own relationship to being, to belonging, and self-evidencing. When I refer then to the poetics of the Black Mediterranean, I'm thinking of this capacity in relation to the coalitional practice of transing borders, which is to describe the adjective, trans hyphen, which is to describe a coalition of what has been and what is on the horizon of being. Trans, then, marking a series of attachments, of renunciations and revisions in order to foreground an attachment to movements and the emergence of new possibility. As a form and in its function, Black transpoesis leads us to that contrapuntal belonging, attending to a Black belonging as a set of questions rather than fixed facts, and embracing geographies of non-belonging, such as the refusal of assimilation as within its terrain. Thinking about what remains in possibility, we might reflect on certain paradigms that lead to the normalization of violence undergirding what both ultranationalists and liberal humanists have referred to as a crisis of migration. But what we can see then is more a crisis of white national and supranational identity. I definitely forgot to time myself, Clarina. Do you think? I had it here. How much time do you think? 3 minutes? Perfect. Great. Quickly, and thank you for your patience. Rah, 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 the state is bad. And then, what is this? White supremacy, white supremacy. Okay. Germany, great. Walter Benjamin, in his theses on the philosophy of history, writes that the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. We must attain a conception of history, he says, that is in keeping with this insight. So then, we shall clearly realize that it is our task to bring about a real state of emergency. Professor Otele has sort of set us up for this perfectly. What is it that you are willing to do? What is it that can be done? This will improve, Benjamin says, our position in the struggle against fascism, end quote. Reading and thinking alongside, being in relation to the Black Mediterranean would then lend historical consciousness to this crisis of migration and take the term crisis seriously from the etymological Greek krisis, meaning a turning point, one that could acknowledge that the contemporary social disintegration of the calculated cruelty of those in power would require a collective response. Above all, it's an ethical project and a call to think otherwise, such that, as Black radical thinker Sean Crawley offers in his Black Pentecostal Breath, The Aesthetics of Possibility, it would be, in simple terms, quote, a return to Black radicality as the space and zone from which otherwise modalities of living can emerge, end quote. One of many in its arsenal is a new politics of naming, a literary practice of complexity and sustained contradiction that carry with them a more livable destiny for us all. An underlying question embedded in these enumerative practices of codifying citizenship can further be clarified by the deep, attentive study of Black life and Black people. Ultimately, so I'll end here, the struggle for citizenship of so-called second generation or other Italians, specifically racialized as non-white, the question remains, what are the seductions for state-oriented activism for which traumatized citizenship, from Jin Haritaron, is more than merely an identitarian pitfall, but rather a key beyond emergency, and really radical emergence. What would a politics of citizenship and representation look like so that we can refuse any and all murderous inclusion, which Jin Haritaron has told us describes a depoliticization of inclusion of queer people, for example, under the liberal rubric of gay rights, such as same-sex marriage. So gay as in same-sex marriage and not gay as in the abolition of the state, for example. I think we can guess where I land. Something that I want us to close with, want us to really think through is, do we want the state to love us, whoever us might be, or do we want to be free? Is what we're fighting for conditional citizenship, or are we making the demands and laying the grounds for our own emancipation? The goal of the white West is, of course, to refuse and to prevent and destroy collaborative rebellion against empire. We need not let that succeed outright. We might divest from citizenship as the foundation for a broader process of reparation for regimes of violence, of exclusion, and marginalization that nation-states have entrenched through anti-Black practices, including, but not limited to, traumatized citizenship. Racial capitalism animates and requires the surveillance, policing, and warehousing of Black communities across the world, advancing their own crisis, supported by and attended to by our own seductions into state structures. Therefore, we invest our energies, our resources, and our talents into the worlds yet to come. Through the literary imagination, we find ourselves at a familiar crossroads, a juncture between crisis, that turning point, and ineffable possibility. Ultimately, this is our moment to lose, and so we must endeavor to meet it together. Thank you.
Where's Olivette? That is the question. Wow. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Dankeschön. I think we should probably resolve the question where Olivette is. I'm sure she can hear us, but we can't see her yet. I wonder if this is going to change in the next 10 to 15 seconds, or can you hear us? Professor Otele?
Yes, I can see you.
Oh,
You
no.
can see us. Okay, we hear you. You're here with us in the space. Your voice is definitely coming through. Oh, there you are. Beautiful. Very beautiful to see you. Thank you so much again, Professor Otele, for this very powerful talk. You can't be with us physically, but the spirit really came through very strongly and beautifully. Thank you so much. Also, SA, thank you for being here with us today. And somewhat talking or finding language for the impossible, I guess. When Corinna contacted me a couple of days ago, I was quite honestly speaking overwhelmed, you know, like how, especially also speaking as an Afro-German, how do we find even language to talk about Europe and even conceptualize, or if it's even worth to conceptualize another Europe. But then also I'm someone who comes from the arts, and this is sort of like the only hope I have, I guess, at this point. And SA, towards the end of your presentation, you were defining and speaking about poesis, and you are a poet yourself too, part of also being an academic and thinker. And I think to start off, I also forgot to say that after 20 minutes or so, we will open up the stage, and I think Corinna had already pointed towards this white box over there. So please feel free to get up and share your questions and thoughts as well. And this is also applying to the online community. I think they can text. There's a number, apparently, please text. Please feel free to share your thoughts, ideas, and questions. We definitely want to open this up and don't, you know, this is not a secluded space. This is an open space, and we want to discuss together. But SA, I thought that we should maybe begin, or that was at least my sort of like idea as someone who comes from the arts, to maybe define this poesis a little more, or why this is so crucial in your work, and also in the question of doing knowledge and making knowledge and embodying knowledge, ideally at some point. Do you want to talk about this a little more?
Magnus, I'd be delighted. Yeah, thank you.
I think it should be on.
Thank you. Yeah, well, I mean, so my first degree was in semiotics, which you can probably tell by how many times I said the word etymological. But so I am always like curious and sort of finding the path of the language that we have been given, or the language that I was first taught. But yes, it is the case that, you know, thinking with poetic speech and poetic language, writing poetry, I'm saying everything but naming myself a poet, but doing all of these things, I wondered of the etymology. And it was interesting because there is another event, the Triennale, and their theme is currency, and so there are some really wonderful...
The Photo Triennale.
The Photo Triennale,
Hamburg,
sorry.
yes,
Yeah,
right,
the Hamburg Photo Triennale, where there was one of the curators was telling us the German etymology of poetry. I'm nervous with my accent, so Magnus, the word for poetry in German?
Gedicht. Gedichte.
Gedichte.
That's plural, yeah, singular.
And it also
poetry.
means density, no?
Proximity, yeah.
Yeah.
Dichte.
And so I've been thinking about, you know, like what does it mean, poetry, in the languages that I do speak? But actually, what it really comes down to is the idea of proliferation, right? When I talk about sort of making ourselves anew and making new things, that is actually one of the most joyous and life-giving things that Black people have done. I don't know if you spend time on Twitter. I apologize if you do. It's somewhat a toxic space, but there's also so much joy in that space. But you know, a tragedy happens, right? And then the sub-community in that vast digital space, like Black Twitter, which is very nebulous, right? But you know, within minutes, there are memes, there's some kind of joke, there is some kind of proliferation after the tragedy and the trauma. And that is how, I mean, I can't speak for every Black person, but I'm familiar across different ethnicities, different languages and nation states, right? That, you know, you give a Black person a trauma and then we make music, right? You give us trauma and we have the blues. You give us the worst part of the pig and you have Black Southern cuisine in the United States, you know what I mean? Or you have, there's this capacity to proliferate joy and our own satisfaction. And when then we think on just an embodied level, I also have been struggling with how to name and rename and shift and reshift. So without talking too much longer, you know, my father's people are Central American. So now he would be called Afro-Latino if you were around, if he were still here. But that's not a term that he used to refer to himself. But there's always like new language to say how we fit in alongside something else, new hyphens and hyphenation. But what I'm actually really invested in is Black people's capacity to capacitate ourselves, right? The capacity of Blackness is not just, and I learned this from Toni Morrison, right? And playing in the dark, whiteness and the literary imagination, right? It's not just that they came to be a term for the people heretofore racialized as Black, but there is something else, and we are speaking a different language, right? Aimé Césaire said, you know, to when he was writing to the Cahiers du Cinéma, or someone in France in his time, and he was saying, you call us noir, but that's wrong. We are noir. We are not speaking the same language. And there is something so powerful in, instead of trying to find the next thing, as an academic, as an artist, we're constantly like, how do I get the new, to get that new funding, to be able to do my work? But instead, we can sort of sit in the quiet place and reckon with Black people, Blackness, the capacity to capacitate itself and ourselves. And poesis for me is the way of doing that, right? Creating something not just out of nothing, but the pieces and fragments that we have been left with and or given and or made, they're already in there is something elsewise. If we just orient ourselves collectively into that, I wonder what else would exist.
Professor Otele, I also wanted to pose a similar question to you as well, because you are a historian, and as a historian you work with records and data and sort of like these very manifest, you know, statistics. How, and I don't know if this is true or not, but how much is the imaginative force still important to you when you work? You know, I imagine, you know, you seeing a lot of archives and documents and evaluating and sort of like working within these very academic parameters. But I also hope that the imagination plays an important role in your work. And maybe you want to elaborate a little more on that.
Sure, yes. I'm a historian, but I'm also a memory scholar. So my research is really mashing those things almost competing constantly. What does it mean? It means that the archives have limits and the archives speak various languages and various levels of meanings. So, you know, most historians will acknowledge that because the archives have limits, we do what Hayden White talked about in Plotment. There's a degree of fictionalization and hypothesis that you put in place, and you basically speculate when the archives can't respond or can't provide answers. So there's that for the historian. As far as memories, you know, the memory work is concerned, is essential for me, particularly in the area of research and the area of research I'm doing, because we don't necessarily have archival material when it comes to the history of people of African descent. And yet that history has been transmitted from generations to generations. We don't have the minute details of numbers, and yet cultural practices have been transmitted. And yet there's a strong history of not just resistance or resilience, but liberation. You know, I said earlier on, people of African descent have been plotting. We have been plotting for centuries, and we will keep on doing that. And I say we, that brings me to probably the core of what I believe in and what I've seen is the collective. The collective is the only way for me forward, because it's through the collective that we have seen, it's been proven empirically that the collective have moved us to this place where we are. And we are stuck in those ladders and in those cages where the collective is fractured by individual opportunities. And those individual opportunities are also inhibitors. They are also the tools for oppression. And how do we reclaim those to put them back to the collective and achieve what we need to achieve for liberation is a constant question that I'm grappling with. It's probably going to do that for the rest of my life, but hey.
You mentioned this we, and I know that when we talked 2 days ago, SA, we had already, or you had begun to problematize this we, which is important, right? Because when we talk about we also, I mean, we had talked 2 days ago in preparation for this conversation, and I was really struggling with sort of like imagining tonight, because as an Afro-German, there is no real we. It's very challenging for us to even claim space in this country because there's no data, for example, and Germanness is so heavily tied to whiteness that in the German, white German imaginary, it's white Germans can't conceive of people being German who are not white. So they really have an issue with their own sort of like imagination and imaginative forces in a way. Because you also see potential in this we, if you dig deep enough, if I understand you correctly, and if you don't fall into this trap of this ethno-nationalism of Europe. Do you want to talk about your we, our we?
Yeah, okay. It's like, it's fraught, you know, because I have conflicting thoughts. But
I think your mic is not working. I think
it's.
Is it?
No?
Yeah.
Hello.
Yeah, it's working. Yeah.
Thank you. So what I did before was I just chuckled and tried to censor myself, which I will undo, because it is fraught. No, I'm not even being facetious. I'm trying to be careful, precisely because of the heart of the question, which is the multi-constitutive we. There's semantics again, you know, but I think a lot about pronouns, especially as a queer person these days, and sort of sometimes they get referred to as preferred, or sometimes they get, you know, but the pronouns of the like he or she or they or ze or these other neo-pronouns are not even where I want to go as a queer subject. And really, I want to talk about the we. I think that's the more fraught pronoun, and we trick ourselves into sort of an individualizing thing of what it means to like misname or missee or misgender an individual, when the collective has been not misgendered, but misrecognized and misnamed. And I think why I was saying I want to be careful is because you are Afro-German, right? And so but there's something that I'm thinking of, and I spend a lot of time with Black Italians or Afro-Italians, and so sometimes I'm trying to grapple with my own seductions, which are abolitionist in nature, and so my tendency to sort of burn it down. If anyone has seen Angela Bassett with the burning car, you know, that's really in my spirit. Olivette knows exactly the one. But like, we are tired, and I actually do want to bring in Professor Otele into, when there's an exhaustion, some parts of me really wants to just set it on fire. What does it give me to fight for, you can call it equality or even equity or liberation, or the words that we shift and have overlapping meanings but never quite the same, we can fight for us, and I fundamentally as well believe in a collective.
Yes.
But what does it do when I sign on to the letter as a European citizen? Or a citizen of Europe, or post-Brexit, question marks. But, what does it mean if I'm saying, we British citizens, we fight against, or like, we Jamaicans, we decry the, does it really do something when I name a we bound to a nation state? When that nation state, it's really an open question. What does it do? Right? Does that actually constitute that I have forged that we, or does the we last for as long as the petition circulates online? Does the we last for as long as my signatures are eligible, or I can go to the voting ballot in a certain nation state or another, and then cast my vote and claim that I've done my job, as though the system itself, as Professor Otele has already said, is really forged against that self-same us. So it's not that I think that the we has potential, but rather, but maybe it is. I won't veer it back into the negative, but I think that it deserves attention, and I think that if we attend to it, we can figure out who we is, because that self-we, I'm framing it in, because I know there's a virtual conversation as well that we are part of right now. We're all coming from different sorts of spaces, but the we of the digital signature, is that the same we as like, we European citizens stand for this, we Germans mean that? I'm not sure, and I think the we obscures and causes harm in that obscurance. And so whenever I feel that way, my move is to sort of divest and actually say, what is underneath that we? What am I trying to mobilize? Right? And similar words with we are the ones we've just hailed, like community, right? So, a black man is murdered in the United States or in Britain or in France, and we need to rise up against police violence. Well, some of us have been rising up. Professor Otele just said so. Some of us have been doing that work for literally centuries and generations. Are we going to keep doing that? Because some of us are tired. So who is the we that needs to really be doing the work? And so it's not really rhetorical. I mean it, I hope I was clear. The fear is like not wanting to allied, because a we of Afro-German experience, at least I do have that. Professor Otele is one of 2 black women professors, but at least there are black women professors in Germany, in the UK, and in Germany it's a complete, in Italy it's a complete, in Spain, There is something in this numeration, but it does also obscure the violence of what really is possible if the we who needs to be hailed when we say it answers the call.
Do you want to add to it, Professor Otele, or?
Yes, I mean, we can spend all night. So the we is fragile, the we is fluid, and the we can be a danger, the we can be unifying depending on the context. The we is so many things. And the we for me echoes what SA said, which is, started with actually the idea of belonging, and that I talked about the idea of home. What is home? Where is home? Do we need home? Home changes. Home, we're forced to find new homes because of the reality of who we are. And therefore, how do we remake a home that is that responds to what new generations are facing? It's something I'm grappling with, because I realized recently that I'm old. And then what I believe in is not exactly what my 20-year-old is telling me about in terms of kind of sense of belonging, racialization, and so on and so forth. And it's me trying to make sense of what is it that my fight is actually has been doing and is doing for these generations.
What is your 20-year-old telling you?
He's telling me that, my focus on racialization obscures certain things. It obscures the gender aspect of it, the gender-based aspect of it. Ableism is something else. There are many fights out there that my focus on race has obscured, and therefore I need to bring them, not just bring them to the folder, but actually learn from them. And many other things that are less nice, but that's it for you.
You can definitely, I feel bad
Why?
for baby Otele, but we just put him on blast right now because, of course, we know, and we've learned through your work as well, that race is always already gendered and gender is already racialized. So you're not disagreeing. And what we say is being obscured is actually those same systems of, we already know, right, about intersections. Like this intersectionality, and I mean intersectionality, right, the way that Kimberly Crenshaw meant it, and not just at the crossroads of things, but right, you cannot be black and a woman. You are a black woman, and that specifically means something about your lived experience in the world. So you can say black. This is, sorry to go back, but this is also what I mean, just to maybe make it less abstract. When I say something about blackness as like the ability of blackness to capacitate itself. Why do I now have to say I'm an Afro-Latin, I'm adding on to the different ways that I'm saying black. When I say black, I mean that I'm queer. When I say black, I mean I'm a feminist. When I say black, I mean I'm trans. When I say black, right, I mean that my people are black indigenous people to their own place in their own time. When I say black, I mean it. It capacitates itself. And the partitioning that we are coerced into doing is part of the, I feel, maybe the underlying fragility of the we that Professor Otele is talking about.
I have a lot more questions, but I also have there's always this thing, like you have this Q&A session, then we building this dynamic and the audience stays passive, and I don't like that. And we're also in a performance venue, so this is not my understanding of performance and life, and also doing blackness for sure. So please, let's open it up. If it's probably intimidating. I don't know who invented this white box over there. No. I would feel really intimidated to walk up there. But if people want to ask questions, I think we should start opening it up because we have these amazing two speakers and thinkers with us. Ah, wonderful. Ah, you don't even have to. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Forget the white box, yeah.
Yeah, so first I wanted to say a big thank you. It was very, very interesting. I'm not sure I grasped everything, but there was some new elements which give me food for thought. I have a question for SA. You were saying that there's a distinction between black bodies, black lives, and black people. So I would like you to elaborate a little bit on it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for the question. Sometimes I do say I look forward to talking about something in the Q&A, but that well, it's like it's a metaphor for the bar, you know. Okay. These are just like parts of rants that I have with myself. But Olivette, Professor Otele is an historian, and again, and many other things. And just to be clear, I also think Toni Morrison was an historian.
Of course.
Audre Lorde is an historian. So I. Obviously, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do find Professor Otele in this imaginative genealogy as well. One of the other things that white supremacy does is bifurcate by nature of disciplining. As academics, we are in disciplines, and that is, one of the most immediate, it's most apparent distinctions. As an aside, by this I mean it's something that I've noticed, and I'm writing something about this, so I can say a little bit more. In a few months, but it's over time this tendency that I've realized, right, of linguistic drift from the black person, right, and also maybe in the contra form, if you can say it this way, of blackness's ability to capacitate itself. We know that whiteness's ability is to subsume, consume, and it's not, as you said, imaginative, right? It's consumptive. It is dynamic, right? As Professor Otele said, racism will always adapt. It's going to find something else. The goalposts will continue to shift unless we burn down the goal. But there's been a shift, from the global Black Lives Matter movement that started, of course, in the United States, and it was like Black Lives Matter, yeah? And then, of course, we're presented with the All Lives Matter, but then we start talking about Black life. So, as in my research, sort of just glossing some archives, some newspapers, social media frequency and terminology, then you start to see, even in top papers, and then in the parlance of just day-to-day people, like Black life, right? You have Black people, but it is coming mostly from non-Black people initially, and then it comes part of our vernacular and day-to-day speech, where it's just like, well, black life is important, black life is precious. Well, 4 black lives were felled today. And I'm like, well, what is behind the life? Who is that, right? A black life? Are you a black life? Am I a black life while I'm sitting here living? It sort of destabilizes us from the actual embodied practice of living. And then we have a further linguistic drift of black bodies, right? George Floyd is now a black body and not a man with a child felled in front of her, right? The life then is evacuated, the person is then evacuated, right? And so sometimes it is useful, right? Because we're talking about the figure of black people, right? Or the figure of the black body, the figure of the black body. But I try to have pause in the words that I use, as I think we all ought, but because I don't want to then unwittingly be a part of the project of my own dehumanization. I don't want to be anybody's black body. And I think it's important to it's just like, again, that's why I said at the bar, because it really is like a rant and a pet peeve when we use it in day-to-day speech. I don't mean like in the talk we're having today, where we're specifically speaking about the black body and black bodies and their figuration in the world through the lens often of white supremacy. I'm speaking, though, of just like you and I are talking and we're going to have a cigarette in, 20 minutes? And we're talking, and then it's just like, yeah, there were like 5 black bodies at the train station. I mean, like this is how I'm hearing it used in day-to-day, right? And that is incredibly violent because you know who says that? The police, the state. They see 5 teenagers in the plaza, in the Platz there, and then they don't see, 5 like mother's favorite children, right? 5, one of whom wants to be an engineer, one of whom wants to be a poet, one who wants to be an architect, one who wants to stay at home and bake with his mother, right? They see 5 black bodies, and I refuse to give them the language to afford them that lens to constitute my life when that's all that whiteness has been doing for generations. No? Does that make sense? And so we affirm black life. I say Black Lives Matter, right? I'm concerned with the plight of the figuration of black bodies through the lens of white supremacy. But I know that I'm invested in black people. And we're the people in the way that the West starts framing our existence.
Are there more questions? I wanted to just to have that short break to digest. And if people from the online community ask questions, we would somehow know that, but okay. If you want to ask questions, please feel free to text. There's a number, apparently. I find that so cool that people can text questions. Please use it. Are there more questions from the audience? Is it too intimidating?
I'm so much fun at parties.
You want to go to the bar, right? I wish we could take you, Professor Otele. Take the screen, because we have the screen, Professor Otele, and we would love to take it to the bar so we can
have an online drink, is it?
Yes, like in virtual. Do you want to say it more?
Yes.
Okay.
I have a question.
Oh.
It won't be for you. I'm saving it, I realize. My question is for Professor Otele. It just is really moving, always hearing you speak. When you say, you're tired, I'm slightly less historically tired, we're tired. What is it that you do to replenish yourself in this moment? Is there a thread of what you find in the work that you do, or is it elsewhere?
Oh, that's such a almost loaded question, because it's only recently that I have started self-caring. I had to burn out and then go through bereavement to kind of decide that less is more. It's not just less work, is less of the running is more, because in the long run, I'm not actually helping the communities I'm with, or the people I serve, or my family, or anything. In other words, in academia, we produce, we're push to produce so much, to question it, to push the boundaries so much, because this is how it is. This is how you, it's not even about academic progress or whatever. It's just the machinery is demanding that from us, that we forget in the long run that this is not sustainable, and therefore we burn out. And for me, the one thing that, so less academic production as such, but more involvement in what really where my heart is, which is the connection with people on a daily basis and in everyday life. It's not glamorous, it's not written somewhere, but how is it that whatever I do change something for the better? And this is the hardest bit, because I can't change things for the better if I'm not well. Mm-hmm. And therefore, we go back to self-care as being a political act. And this is where I am at the moment. I don't know if I answered your question, actually.
But that was a very strong statement. You can't change anything for the better if you're not well yourself. I think that is so important. And I was just thinking, when you had mentioned your 20-year-old, we had talked a little bit about this German experience, and we are in Hamburg, in the end. I live in Berlin, but one of the beautiful, I grew up in the West, in Nordrhein-Westfalen, on the west side of Germany, and one of the beautiful things, I'm 34 now, so it's beautiful to see that there are more Black people in Germany. I see more Black people in Germany in the streets when I go home and see my mom. And but at the same time, when you were mentioning your 20-year-old, I went back home a couple of weeks ago and had this experience of like, wow, there are like, Black people in like downtown in the city center. But then I'm also at the same time so concerned, because I have this privilege of like, I don't know if it's really a privilege, but I experience a proximity to whiteness because I have a white German family, and I feel also I know how white Germans work, and I'm concerned for all of our young people in this country, because this place is very challenging, and as we were just saying, white Germans can't conceive of Germanness not immediately connected to whiteness. And I'm just really, and it's an open question maybe also to the audience, like what can we do here too, And that's like, and it's difficult because, Europe has its specificities, European countries have their specificities. But yeah, this is kind of like it's a very pressing question we have in Germany. Yeah.
Oh yeah, so to go back to the idea of being tired, it's an interesting one, because SA said about how we self-actualize ourselves as Black people. We're tired, but it doesn't mean that we can't act. Tiredness, you don't have to be hopeful to act. You can do it afraid, you can do it tired. In fact, you have to just carry on. Doing it. And when I say doing it, is the one that I said about the practice of changing things on a daily basis.
There's one more question, yeah. Can we turn on the mic for the audience? Okay. Okay.
Hello.
There you go.
Oh, yeah.
Hi.
So I was still sorting my thoughts, but adding on to the tiredness and the abolitionist thoughts and kind of reuniting identity in Germany or in Europe in general, also this sentiment of just saying goodbye to things. And you mentioned something about grief and how grief rearranges ways of viewing things, and I was wondering if you could like expand on that for a moment, especially in regards of maybe that being the I don't know, like a seed of being able to, or capacitate, or I don't know, the words, you know what
That's
I
the word. Yeah, no, it's a good question. I'm sure there are different kinds of loss. There's another word for grief, which imagines an ex thing, a dead thing, but there are other kinds of living loss that globally Black people have experienced on a daily basis. but in the grief, in the physical sense, I have lost a lot of people recently to COVID-19, to some suicide, but also, I mean, I hesitate with that word, and I also talked about it today, and I've written about it before. You know, there's like, there's the, you know, the biopolitical of like letting live, and then the necropolitical of letting die, that the state is in the business of. And so sometimes, you know, it's hard for me, like suicide meaning you kill yourself. And without going on yet another rant, I think there is for many of the communities in which I am an active member, there is an intentional desire to let us die. That happens in our disenfranchisement, our dispossession, but even in like what I sometimes feel is like a state-supported suicide. There's a concerted effort to have some of us not live. And so that's just, again, an aside, I'll leave it there. But when I say this thing about grief reorganizing, there's a reorganizing capacity to grief, it means this. There is, I recently lost my grandfather, and that's the person who, I got the best lessons of masculinity from, the softest lessons, the most powerful lessons, indigenous, Caribbean lessons from. And my reference is sort of, I'm not going to talk about it. I'm not crying on camera. But, when the referent is gone, the foundation of who you are doesn't exist. So I am foundationless in a way, and there's like a destabilizing thing that's in the aftermath of someone who is close to you that is gone. There's a space in which they were within you as well as in the world. And when that ceases to exist, I feel that there is a reorganizing that happens. Sometimes there are many, many different ways to talk about it in many different cultures, but there is something that I've seen about, some people think that like grief gets smaller with time, but actually it's that our container gets bigger and grief is like the same size. But I wonder if even a step further on a molecular and emotional level, if we are just reorganized, we are completely different. The person I was last week is fundamentally not the person that I am today or can be tomorrow. And if we think about that, to use an I statement, when I think about that, and then I also think about Emmanuel Kiri Namdi, who is a migrant in Italy who was murdered by vigilantes who were themselves, white Italians who were disenfranchised and took it out on the first black person they could see. When I think about George Floyd, when I think about there's so many names, right? We're also given this litany, but it is a litany of grief. And much like, it sort of goes, I think, connects with what Professor Otele has just told us in terms of you don't have to be in a good mood, you don't have to be hopeful, sort of carry on and do the work of making a better life, making a better world. I think, though, if we also connected with beyond the binary of, black loss, black abjection, black death, and then the binary of black joy, black, there's the opposite, right? The joy and, the Afro-pessimism or the optimism, there's this. But if there's this other way that we can think about grief work, wake work, Christina Sharp called it. Robin Cost-Lewis, who's also here at the Currency Festival, the Photo Triennale, is talking about, right? If we think about attending in the midst and in the wake of the ongoing litany of grief, really naming in witness, we don't have to really say it out loud, naming in witness how it reorganizes our lives, I wonder then if that is something that we can and have and are harnessing in order to say, if I'm already being reconstituted by this thing that happened to me, that happened to my community, that happens to my people for generations, well, we're already in the business of reconstituting. Let's really make something new, right? Let's fucking burn it down. What do I have to lose, right, if all we've been given is loss? What is it that we can make otherwise? Am I making sense, or am I just very sad? Both can be true. But, it's like a way to say, well, I already feel the shift and the change, right? Every time a black person is murdered, every black person I know feels it. I never met George Floyd. I cried when I found out he died, when he was murdered, right? Christy Schwindeck, I never met her. right? I'm constantly feeling a rage in the depths of my diaphragm whenever people are putting together memorials and agitating for. I never met Adama Traoré, right? I'm in the streets of Paris whenever I'm there, organizing with people, right? Being in the streets, right? In fellowship over the life he could and should have lived. We already know this. And to name it as grief and to not keep ourselves distant from it so that we don't have this cognitive dissonance that some of my community and the people I talk to experience, where they're like, they know we have to fight and be in the street and we're exhausted because we're always in the streets, we're always there, and we're always agitating, and what's really changing or what's being shifted and more of the same, like Professor Otele was talking about. But what if we named it as grief? We are in mourning, we are reconstituting. What if we really took that and gave it its own name, you know?
Thank you.
That's what I meant. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. I think
I'm such a bummer.
we will, no, this was not this no, because there's still the bar. The bar is still happening. I think
are we coming towards an end?
we're coming towards an end.
Because I don't want to leave on this. It feels heavy, but I did.
But also hopeful. It's not.
Yeah,
it's
I want to
not-
be
it is not-
clear.
at least I don't feel.
Good,
I don't feel
okay.
heavy. It's hopeful. It's true. It's vast. There's
Yeah.
space. There's a lot of space.
Good, and because there's nothing actually more. We already have so much of it. Something like grief. And it's one of those, like, if you think about, in constellations in terms of the stars, and like you can't really count them all, we already have so much of this, and it really is already shaping us. So I really encourage people listening to not dwell, and I say this as a total depressive. I already said I was an academic and a poet. You get what's going on, right? But, rather than like dwell and just like, well, this was an X person, right? Again, Professor Otele's work, right? Memory work is this,
Yes.
right? Here are the pieces and the fragments, and here's a partial thing which we can never fully recover from this archive that they've given us, but here's a story and here's a life. That is so beautiful. That is so joyous if we let it be that. And it fuels me when I don't want to get out of bed for my own self. I know that I have a community, and that community cosmologically is from the past, it's from the present. What is coming next?
It's simultaneous. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's always
Yeah.
there. Okay, Professor Otele, I want to thank you again so much. Thank you for joining us virtually. All the best to you in the UK. All the best to your 20-year-old too. And take care, and I hope we'll see you soon in Germany.
Thank you ever so
very
much.
much.
I'll see you
SA
Thank you,
as well.
everyone.
Dankeschön, vielen Dank. Danke.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
And to you as well. So.